We're here in the Harvard Yenching Library at Harvard, and we're talking to Steve Owen, a great authority on Chinese literature, and then particularly in the poetry of the Tang Dynasty. So, let's begin. As an historian, when I think about literature, I think about it as, in some sense, the way to think about culture. And in the Chinese case, I go back to say, well, we have this notion of sort of both the notion that there are patterns in the world that we can translate into human affairs, into the ordering of human affairs, to the idea that there are classics, that there are a series of texts that accumulate over time, that there's a notion of the civil versus the military, that we can take people who are schooled in culture and who can write and who know the texts, and we can entrust them with a responsibility for government. So that's sort of an historian's take on why literature and being literary and literacy all matter. But in some sense, it doesn't help me understand why poetry matters. And so that's why we ask you to come here to help guide us.
Well, let's think of poetry in a larger sense. But poetry is certainly, it's really it's hearing that in action. This was the promise in the classical poetry, that you were, there's one thing of knowing history, it's another thing of being there, hearing it, hearing somebody talk about it, and the promise that you could actually make that moment last, make that person last, make that response last. That's a grand promise. And that you have immediate access to the past, not mediated historian's knowledge, but really immediate access, if you read well. And of course, the famous essay on literature by Cao Pi says literary works are the greatest accomplishment in the workings of the state. A splendor that never decays. Glory and pleasure go no further than the body. To extend both of these to all time, nothing can compare with the unending permanence of a work of literature. It was for this reason that writers of ancient time gave their lives to the ink and the brush, and that's a nice phrase. They spent their lives on it, time on it, and revealed what they thought in their writings. Without recourse to a good historian or dependence on a powerful patron, their reputations have been passed on to posterity on their own force.
Well, that's a big claim, isn't it?
It's a huge claim, and it's not always true, but it's a promise.
It's a promise. I mean, but it's both political. What strikes me about this passage is that it's both political in the first sort of paragraph, but in the second paragraph it says, but it doesn't depend on politics. There's something here that has enduring value beyond what historians think and what politicians do.
Indeed.
Yeah. But there is, if we think of the Book of Odes, the Book of Poems, as sort of this primal work of literature in Chinese history, it's also at the same time, isn't it sort of responses to the political order of the day? Or? It's
responses to the political order of the day. I think that's one thing true about Chinese poetry, that it always contextualizes. But again, it's one thing to know it, another thing to be there and hear it. And as the classical poetry, the Book of Odes says, poetry articulates what's on the mind, right?
Well, this is that famous phrase, shi yan zhi,
right? And that's, that you actually hear the moment in the poem.
So are we in a situation then when we're thinking about poetry as sort of self-expression, the individual expressing himself or herself and responding to the moment? Is that it?
I think that's it, but that subsumes history in itself.
What do you mean?
I mean that history gives you, the knowledge of. It depends on what can be manipulated, the way you can massage data. But the promise of poetry is you really reveal, when you speak in poetry, you reveal how you really feel about it. You reveal what's there. That's why you don't depend on the good historian.
Well, but in a sense, when you're saying you reveal what's there, poetry is still, a poet is interpreting the world, isn't it?
A poet's interpreting the world, but can you interpret the world without somebody responding to it?
Okay. Can you give me an example?
I could give you the way the classical poetry was read.
Okay.
That is that that what would we know about what's going on in the domains, how it was, without the persons speaking of the situation.
So in that sense, the record of poetry is also a kind of reality of its own.
It is a reality of its own. It's a mediated reality. By that I mean that it's the way an individual sees it, and the way an individual responds to it, but what we know of the world is always that.
Okay. Tao Qian comes up as one of the great early poets in Chinese history. Also as an example of somebody who's responding to the world in a way that sort of goes through the prism of his own consciousness and personal experience.
And that's a sort of another level of poetry, which is to use poetry in your life.
Okay, so I'm going to read you a Tao Qian poem.
Okay.
And I want you to then tell us how we should read it and how we should think about it.
Okay.
So this is the poem that it goes like this. I built a cottage right in the realm of men, yet there was no noise from wagon and horse. I ask you, how can this be so? The mind far away, its place becomes remote. I picked a chrysanthemum under the eastern hedge, and off in the distance gazed on South Mountain. Mountain vapors glow lovely in twilight, where birds in flight come together and return. I have a sense of some truth in this. I want to expound it, but have lost the words.
Well, let's put that in context, like a good historian would do. Tao Yuanming served, and he found it made him unhappy. The only legitimate...
Served, you mean?
In the government. The only legitimate thing for a person to do, for a member of the gentry, was to serve in the government. But it made him unhappy. And so he decided to give up his position and go back and take the very risky business of farming. Now, that's a hard decision to make. And much of his poetry is about justifying that choice, reflecting on that choice, reflecting on the world that he himself had chosen. Right? And the poem basically says that. I built a cottage in the realm of men. I'm right here in a village. It's noisy outside, but I don't hear any of that. Well, you have to hear it not to hear it.
I ask you, how can this be so?
How can this be so? Because the person creates their own space. And the mind far away, then the place becomes remote. And then I picked a chrysanthemum under the eastern hedge, and off in the distance gazed on South Mountain. And something's missing there.
Well, you started out by saying that he had built a cottage right here in the realm of men.
Yes, and that somehow has disappeared.
Right.
He looks down, he looks up.
Right.
He refuses to see that space, or does not see that space even.
Its place becomes remote.
The place becomes remote.
And the mind is far away.
The mind is far away, and the eyes are going off to those mountain vapors, which the sun's hitting, and seeing the birds returning there. And of course, the famous thing, I have a sense of truth in this. I want to expound it, but have lost the words. And you catch him gazing, reflecting, far away, the mind being far away. So he's created his own world. Now that's very different than what we're saying about the Book of Odes.
Right, right.
But it's a new possibility for poetry. Right. You know, Tao Yuanming is certainly well over 1,000 years after the Book of Odes. Right. And poetry's taking on new functions, new roles.
And it's also taking on, in a sense, it's taking on authorship, it seems to me, as well.
Oh, very much here.
Right.
So one was, almost everything in the Book of Odes is anonymous. Right. So it's speaking of a moment in a kind of normative voice. But this is only Tao Yuanming here. Right?
And everyone would know it was Tao Yuanming.
Everyone would know it was Tao Yuanming. Everyone did know it was Tao Yuanming.
Do people still read Tao Yuanming today?
Oh, certainly.
I know in the 11th century we find people reading it, but he's lasted.
I think it was in a 5th grade Chinese school textbook. They were going over this poem. That's a large audience.
Very large audience indeed.
We were talking about Tao Yuanming.
Tao Qian, Tao Yuanming.
Tao Yuanming, right. And we can move from that to the way poetry eventually comes to interact with others. If Tao Yuanming is a solitary voice, then you begin to have individuals speaking to other individuals. Right? A nice example, one of the most famous examples in Tang poetry, is a Wang Wei poem, which has several names, but its technical name is Sending Mr. Yuan on his way on a mission to Anxi. Now, Anxi is in the middle of Central Asia. It was not a pleasant place to go on a mission.
Well, it's way out past, in fact, going beyond Xinjiang even, way across the mountains, Xinjiang. Right?
Yes, that's probably the edge of Afghanistan, I think. That's where you're going.
Wow.
And In the Tong, when you went on a mission like that, all your friends would go out with you for the first stage of the journey. You would drink heavily, sleep over, and then see the person on his way. This became in the Tong the equivalent of singing Auld Lang Syne on New Year's Eve, you know, that everybody knew that every time there was a party, you always would sing this poem. This is by the walls of Wei City, the rain at dawn dampens the light dust. All green around the guest lodge, the colors of willows revive. I urge you now to finish just one more cup of wine. Once you go west out Yang Pass, there will be no more old friends.
Well, at first glance, it seems to me that that's sort of like, yeah, you're going away, goodbye.
It does, but what freedom does a person have when he's being sent on a mission? You know, you have to go. Here it is. First, he creates the inviting space. Wei City is just north of Chang'an. It's the first stage of the journey. It's beautiful mornings, green. And he says, just finish one more cup of wine. So please stay a little longer. That's a freedom you do have. And poetry creates that space of freedom rather than just saying goodbye. And then the harsh persuasion. Once you go, no more old friends. And so that persuades him that he better stay and have one more cup of wine. It's not a big thing to do, but it's poetry making a small space of freedom in a larger space of unfreedom.
So in some sense, what you've shifted now from is the self-reflective poet of Tao Qian to the poetry as actually creating a moment
Creating
which
a moment.
can be shared with others,
That's right.
in which you speak with others.
So if we begin with a normative voice in a in a historical situation, in the Book of Odes, and then the poet creating his own private reality in Tao Qian or Tao Yuanming. Here we move poetry as social action, in which poetry is used to sort of create a moment, create a space, create a relationship.
Now, Wang Wei was from the Tang Dynasty, and we've talked a bit in this course. I think we will, or we have already talked about the Tang Dynasty, and Tang Dynasty is as having both being a cosmopolitan world, a moment in Chinese history, but also being an aristocratic world with an aristocratic court culture. And one of the things that happens in Tang was the creation or the establishment of the civil service examination, which, although it wasn't used to really populate the bureaucracy as it was later, it still was a very important way for people who were ambitious. And what's always struck me about that as being strange is that poetry is being tested in the examinations. So we have poetry as social practice and so on, but what's happened by this era to poetry and as sort of as part of, how integrated has it become in Chinese society, or is it really only a court culture practice?
It certainly began as a court culture practice, and probably the poetry is not introduced into the examination system until the last part of the 7th century, which is the reign of Empress Wu. And what that did was it opened up at least an imaginary route for people from all over the empire to go and have a hope of getting office. And the one thing, you know, Lord so-and-so's idiot nephew might very easily find a post, but Lord so-and-so's idiot nephew couldn't write a poem. And so that gradually, as poetry became institutionalized in the examination system, it became highly desirable for people to take the examination system. It became a way, sort of a form of prestige that even Lord so-and-so's idiot nephew might want to take. But what it also does is it creates a world outside the examination. It creates a community of people writing poetry to each other who've learned to write poetry, who are in the capital, hoping to get a position, hoping to pass the examination. And that world is, the poetry of that world is very different from the poetry of the court. So gradually the court becomes irrelevant in the world of poetry over the course of the 8th and 9th century.
But I wonder if there's not something that's a little bit, that's related in the sense that in the examinations, the promise is the poem will reveal the man. And outside of, in the world of poetry, outside of outside of the court and outside of the exams, isn't there still some conviction that poetry is authentic, that the person is being revealed, that you're taking this private self and making it accessible to others?
Yes, indeed, that's very much the case. And in the examination system, you were testing really talent. That was the assumption. That if you somehow this is a peculiar, it's less perhaps related to individuals, sort of revealing the individual self, as it is to showing a person's capacity to put the world together, see the world in an imperially sanctioned way with parallels and balances. Outside is very much revealing yourself, talking to friends, persuading patrons that you are a worthy and nice person. Sometimes in even private situations, revealing how you feel, but then circulating that poem among people you know.
Well, I thought I'd, one of the things that we've thought about with people, the fact that we're still reading poems by a Wang Wei or a Tao Chen today,
Yes.
right? And in some sense makes a poet immortal, right? There was a point in the 3rd, 4th century where people were taking drugs for immortality, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but they're not alive today.
Well, we don't know that they're alive.
But we're still reading poems.
Yeah.
And so there are 2 poets from the Tang that seem to be somewhat different, but both very famous. One is Du Fu and one is Li Bai, Li Bo. And so I wonder if we could ask you to read at least one poem by each person, but also tell us a little bit about who they are. Let's begin with Du Fu, and how to read, or just read one of their poems and bring us through it.
Well, in the case of Du Fu, you have a poet who very self-consciously wrote his life. That is, he was leaving notes in his poems for people who would not, understand perhaps in the future. He documented his life in an unprecedented way. Of course, he lived through the An Lushan rebellion, when in fact the capital fell, the emperor was driven into exile, a new emperor replaced him, a catastrophe for the dynasty. He joined up with a faction which was not favored by the new emperor. He was sent off to a miserable post in between Chang'an and Luoyang, the 2 capitals. And at one moment he decided that he had had it, and for reasons we cannot even imagine, he took his family, his children, his wife, off to a place called Qinzhou, which was poor, not very green, on the boundary between the Tibetan peoples and the Han peoples.
As far away as you could go.
Well, as far away as you could go, on the military routes towards Central Asia. And he wrote, his poetry style changed then. And I'm going to give you one of the poems he wrote in that period, which is called Standing Alone. Now, if the Book of Odes poet talked in a normative voice about the situation, if Tao Yuanming created his own reality, if Wang Wei represents a large body of Tang poetry in which you're writing to others, here's Du Fu very much in a private world, more private even than Tao Yuanming. And it's about a bird of prey and some gulls. So beyond the sky, a single bird of prey. Between the riverbanks, a pair of white gulls. Drifting in the wind, ready for the strike. They go back and forth at their ease. And the dew is so heavy on the plants, the threads of spiders still not drawn in. Nature's workings, so close to human affairs. In thousands of sources of care, I stand alone. It's called Standing Alone. Now, this scarcely looks like a poem. But if you think of Du Fu's eyes, he sees a bird up there, bird of prey. It's hovering. The eyes wonder why the bird of prey is hovering. They imagine it's looking down. He looks down and he sees the second line. Between riverbanks, a pair of white gulls. Now everybody knows the relationship between the hawk and the gulls. He never has to say it. What are the gulls doing flying over the river? They're looking down. What are they looking down for? They're looking down to catch fish. And then his eyes go back up, drifting in the wind, ready for the strike. There's that pause. If you've ever seen a bird of prey strike, there's a moment before it dives. And then he looks down again. They go back and forth at their ease. They're totally oblivious to what's standing behind them. And then Du Fu's eyes suddenly go down. And they probably go down at the very moment the hawk is going to strike. He sees the dew on the plants, and what else does he see? He sees the threads of spiders, the spider web. No doubt with something about to be eaten, not yet drawn in. And then he reflects on this. Nature's workings are close to human affairs. This is what's happening in the human world. And if I was Du Fu, I'd turn around and look behind me at this point. In thousands of sources of care, I stand alone.
This is, all of a sudden, has become a very frightening poem.
Oh yes, it is a very frightening poem.
Right.
But you have to develop that skill of looking at a Tong poem in a certain way to see how frightening it is.
So we'll be reading, or the learners will have a chance to read a number of Du Fu poems and to do more with them and comment on them and try to sort of see into them the way you've been showing us how we could read a poem. But what I liked particularly is when you did this was how you went really line by line. So that each line creates a scene and builds on top of the other. And so it becomes more complicated as we go on.
Indeed, and you know, the things you learn to notice, the way a couplet is put together, in a trivial way, a line high is often matched by a line low.
Right.
But in this case, it's looking up and looking down.
Right.
And in this case, the looking up and looking down takes on meaning, takes on weight.
Let's turn to Li Bai.
Oh, Li Bai.
So who is Li Bai?
Li Bai, it is suspected that Li Bai might have been partially Turkish.
Really?
Yes, but we don't know that.
Turks in the sense of Central Asian Turks.
Central Asian Turks,
yeah,
yes, yes. And his father was named Li Ke, which means Li, the visitor from somewhere else.
I see. Li the guest.
Li the guest, yes. I can't imagine any Chinese parent naming their child Ke, guest. And this is what's called a yuefu, once upon a time a song, but no longer a song, called Bring in the Ale. This is the kind of poem for which Li Bai was perhaps best known, of these wild drinking songs. And it begins, haven't you seen how the waters of the Yellow River come down from heaven, rushing in their flow to the sea, never turning back again? Haven't you seen how in bright mirrors of mighty halls they grieve over whitened hair, at dawn like strands of blue-black silk, by twilight turn to snow? For satisfaction of this life, taste pleasure to the limit, and never let a goblet of gold face the bright moon empty. Heaven bred in me talents, they must be put to use. I toss away 1,000 gold, it comes right back to me. So boil a sheep, butcher an ox, make merry for the while. And in one sitting you must down 300 cups. Hey, master son, ho dan chiu, bring in the ale and do not stop, and I'll sing you a song. I pray you, bend your ears and heed bells and cauldrons, fine foods and jade. It's not these that I prize. All I want is to stay dead drunk, no use to sober up. The sages and worthies of ancient days now all lie silent, and only the greatest drinkers have a fame that lingers on. Once long ago, the Prince of Chun held a party in Pingla Lodge. A gallon of ale cost 10,000 cash, all the joy and laughter they please. So you, my host, how can you tell me you're short on cash? Go right out, buy us some ale, and I'll do the pouring for you. Then take the dappled horse, take the furs worth a fortune. Just call for the boy to take them and trade them for fine ale. And here together we'll melt the sorrows of all eternity. This is not dark, even though it's all about, enjoy the moment and everything else. It's not Du Fu's darkness.
No, not at all. But perhaps you could tell us how you want us to read it, or how you read it better.
I think if you look at the end, that's where you find it. So you, my host, how can you tell me you're short on cash? Mm-hmm. And this is all a persuasion to have his, host go out and spend all his money to get Li Bai drunk. But it's a kind of, I always like to think of parties as special spaces in society where all the normal rules of behavior, they have their own rules, parties have their own rules, but the usual rules are suspended, and we enjoy that suspension for a brief interval. And Li Bai celebrates that unconventionality, to telling you, don't worry about this, don't worry about that.
The ancients are gone, the philosophers aren't speaking.
They're all dead.
Right. So it's that he's put himself outside of culture at this moment and outside of history.
And outside of a certain kind of decorous behavior, which
Right.
was normally, which was expected, right? And he can play that role, and he was immensely seductive in creating that role.
Right.
So people loved that space he was creating of freedom, wildness, rejection of all the usual considerations we're supposed to have.
So rather than, this may not be fair, but rather than, with Du Fu, I have a sense that you have to read deeply, right? And here, I have much more sense that it's sort of all on the surface.
It's really all on the surface, but that doesn't, great poetry can be all on the surface.
Right,
Yes,
okay,
yes.
yeah. And it's sort of expansive and going out and touching all these things and
moments,
creating these moments and spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And breaking free. If Du Fu is always constrained, Li Bai is always trying to break free. And in some ways creating himself as a sort of figure, an eccentric figure, who gives that, inviting him, brings that promise of freedom. So it teaches attention, it teaches relationships, it gives you all sorts of fine models. And people not only have written classical poetry throughout the imperial period, they still write it. They still write it a great deal today. It's on the web all over the place.
We've actually pointed people towards various websites for it, right? Although I don't think that automatic translation will get the flavor across.
No.
Well, this may be too much of my background in intellectual history speaking at this point, but Mencius says, when you read the words, you want to think of the person. And when I read, to what extent, when we read a poet like a Li Bai or a Du Fu, are we also sort of seeing the world through his eyes at that moment? Is that one of the things that Chinese readers in the past or present would have expected? That, oh, now I am sort of one with Du Fu, one with Li Bai, and I'm seeing the world as he saw it.
I think very much so, but there's one of the pleasures of earlier poetry, and this is true of China and elsewhere, is you're immensely close, but you can't get there. It's a peculiar pleasure of an immediacy of a different world, but you can never reach across and really belong to it. So it's both closeness and distance at the same time. And in many ways, there's two ways to work with China. One's to be interested in China, and then be interested in Chinese poetry because you're interested in China. The other way is to be interested in Chinese poetry and be interested in China in order to learn about reading Chinese poetry. That is, I think, one of the interesting issues in literature and the arts in general is, is the particular, does the general contain the particular, or does the particular justify the general?
Well, I want to extend that further and say, in reading Chinese poetry, we're also learning something about reading poetry
Yes.
and thinking about culture.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.